Hey, good morning. So we are doing today Taanit, Daf, Vavam and Beis. However, we are up to Vavam and Aleph. We are right by the parentheses, sort of two-thirds of the way down. Tanya Ida. That's what we're up to right now. Yeah, Tanya Ida. We have another brisa. What does this other brisa teach us? So Tanya Ida. That's the Gemara. Tanya Ida Yered. B'mar Cheshvan, Umalkish B'nisan, Dibra Meir. So our mayor says, excuse me, that Yereb B'mar Cheshvan, Umalkish B'nisan, right, that is the classic shita that we've been saying. The first rains should come in Mar Cheshvan, and the last rains should come in Nisan. V'chachamim Meimrin, Yereb B'Kislev. The Chachamim say that the first rains are going to come in Kislev. So a bit of a later date. Says Gemara, Man Chachamim. Who are the Chachamim that say that the first rain is going to come in a later date? Rav Chizda Rabbi Yosi. So Rav Chizda says that this quote unquote Chachamim is really Rabbi Yosi. Rabbi Yosi is the one who holds that the first rains can come later on in Kislev. The Tanya, because we have a price. So what does the price say? Ezeui Revia Rishayna. What is or when is the first rain? Habechira, like the Bukhar, right? The first. Habechira b'shloshim mar Cheshvan. The first is on the third day of Cheshvan, as we've seen already before. Beinanis b'shiva bar. The second rain comes on the seventh day of Cheshvan. Afela b'shiva asar bar. And the last rain of this first grouping of the rain comes on the 17th day of the month of Cheshvan Divra Meir. Right, we understand the Bechira as being the first, right? The word is sort of interchangeable. It's used as Bechar, as Bechira. We see that by Lloyd's daughters, they use the Lashon Bechira. What about Afela? Afela being the last. Where do you see that as being the last? Rashi brings down the pasuk in a pasuk in Parshas Va'era. The pasuk over there is explaining the barad, what it destroyed, what it didn't destroy. So the pasuk says, right? They were afilois. They weren't hurt because given they were very new, when it came down, it didn't go after them. Yeah. So it was the last. It was the last of the produce. Therefore, didn't get hurt during the barred makkah. It was available to get hurt by Arba. Yeah. So continues the Gemara. So that's the opinion of Rameir. Rameir holds first rain comes on the third of Cheshvan, the second rain on the seventh, and the third on the 17th. Rabbi Yehuda says, the Shiva, the first rain is on the seventh day of Cheshvan. The second is over Yud Zayin. The second one comes on the 17th. Over Esrim V'Shloisha, and then the third of this, again, first grouping of the rain comes on the 23rd day of the month. Fine. Now we have a third opinion, the opinion of Rabbi Yosi. All right, these are all students of Rabbi Akiva. So Rabbi Yosi said what? Rabbi Yosi, I'm Rabbi Yud Zayin. The first rain is the much later date, right? It's 10 days later instead of the 7th. It's the 17th. He actually starts on the 17th. Uva Esrim V'Shloshim on the 23rd, right? So Uva Rosh Chodesh Kislev, and that's how you found now. If somebody says about Kislev, if you remember, when we had started out, we had said that there were opinions that said maybe we should have the rain in Kislev. And over here we just quoted the Gemara again. So far we've seen all these different rains happening in Cheshvan. We never saw any rains happening in Kislev. So now we finally have one. Right? It's not Rabbi Yehuda, it's not Meir, but it is Rabbi Yosi. Rabbi Yosi holds that you can have the first rain. I'm sorry, not the first rain, but the first rains of that grouping of the first rains. The last of the first rains, according to Rabbi Yosi, happens in Kislev. Good. Okay. So continue to talk to Gemara. And so Rabbi Yosi would say, Ein hayechidim misanin ad sheyagia Rosh Chodesh Kislev. That the yechidim are not fasting until you get to Rosh Chodesh Kislev. So this is going to be a fundamental theme in Tainus, right? Taanit is very much discussing the rain. And one of the aspects that we're going to see, a core aspect, is if you don't have the rain, what do you do? What do? You fast, you cry. I have been to in Eretz Yisrael, one of the fasts that they do. They didn't have rain before desalination, changed a lot of things. And I went to it. Ravad Yosef was there, and it was very fascinating how much of Maseches Tainus you have. Everybody davening, doing, Chatzaitzis and Shofar, and it was very, very interesting to see. Um, Again, with sort of desalination being responsible for over 50% of the water today in Israel, it's less urgent. I don't know if they still do the any sort of tanesim for rain at all. One line in this Gemara here, which is very fascinating to me, is yichidim. All right, what's a yachid? So if you look at Rashi, Rashi says yichidim are chasidim. All right, the language is interchangeable. I would not necessarily have known that. Right, a chassid has a specific definition. Right, remember we had the Mishnah in the beginning of the fifth paragraph of Brachas. The Chassidim Arishonim would wait for an hour before they daven. They prepared, they made hachanas before davening for an hour. And then they would daven for an hour. And then after davening, they had to do more hachanas in order to prepare themselves for the day. Right, and that's why more of their asks. You know, the davening 9 hours a day, 3 times a day for the davening. So, and 2 hours of prep for each tefillah. So that's 9 hours a day. They're so busy with davening. So the Gemara says over there, Teras Nechem Lamedes, right? Parnas Nechem Nisparnas. How do they have time to work? How do they have time to learn? So the Gemara says over there, Mitech Shechasidim Ein, Terasan Mishtameres, right? Parnasasan Misbarechet. So because they are Chasidim, their Torah was watched. And even if they didn't learn so much, they remembered it well, and their parnasa, even a little bit that they did, was able to be mizbarach and last for them. But yichidim, we're saying is chasidim. So the people who are on the level of fasting, when the first rains didn't come in, right? So remember, we're going to see later on the progression, right? You have the yichidim, and eventually you're going to have all Chayes to fast, depending on how bad the drought is. So Rashi and the yichidim are chasidim. And why I say I find this very interesting is because in the Spanish Portuguese community, which I don't know if it still exists today, in the few Spanish Portuguese synagogues where they have the same sort of minhag they once did, but they would call like the select members, right? They would call like the head of the community was the parnas, and the elite of the community were the yachids, the yechidim. And they weren't necessarily Hasidim, but they were the ones who had the power and the money in the community. So that's how I always, like when I would come across this term, I would come across the term and sort of the takanas and things of their community, which were not necessarily the people the most learned, they were the people who were the most powerful. But that's not how Rashi's understanding, right? The Yechidim, as we'll see later on, the people who fasted first, the people who, their fasting, their tefillas are going to have the most impact. Those are the Yechidim. That's Rashi says Chasidim. Yeah. Okay, continues the Gemara. So now we found, right, we had a question that the way we opened the Gemara today was you opened the question. The question was, but in this grouping of the first rains, who says that you could have first rains in Kislev? So we said it's Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi is the one who gets us to Kislev. Without Rabbi Yossi, we would all be having the first rains only in Cheshvan. Rav Chizda loch Rabbi Yossi. Rav Chizda says that loch is in fact like Rabbi Yossi. We're going to discuss today, like, what's the difference? I mean, like, who cares? The first rain, the second rain, the third rain. A bunch of meteorologists discussion. Like, I mean, fine. But we'll see there's actually practical nafkaminas for when the first rain is, when the second rain is, that actually has real world impact. Fine, so that's the Gemara. A Meimar Mastin Lahadir Rav Chizda B'Hal Lishna. A Meimar would teach over what Rav Chizda said in this lashon. Right, to me, this reminds me of our Mishnah in Eduyos, which we also had a Gemara in Brachas Mem Zayin. Chayev Adam Loimar, right? A person has to say over what he learns, B'Lashon Rabbi. A person has to say over it in the Lashon that he hears from his Rabbi. And so Ameimer is telling you he has a vart from Rav Chizda, B'Hal Lishna. This is how he heard it. This is how he was going to tell it to us. Right. So what did he hear from Rav Chizda? Again, not exactly on point with what we just said, but nevertheless relevant. So he's talking about the same Talamat of Racha. B'shloshim Marcheshvan Shail and Asakishamim. Right on the third of Marcheshvan is when they start saying the same Talamat of Racha. Or Gamliel Eimer b'Shiva Bay. Gamliel says they start saying the same Talamat of Racha not on the third, but rather on the seventh. Rav Chizda, Halacha Rav Gamliel. So Rav Chizda says that the halacha is like I'm Samemer is telling you that he heard a verdict from Rav Chizda in this lashon, meaning what? Meaning that the lashon that he heard wasn't necessarily about what we just said. In other words, it's not to say that Rav Chizda didn't say both. To me, like okay, maybe Rav Chizda said, that the halachas like Rabbi Yossi that the last of the first rains can come in Kislev, the last of the Yaira rains can come in Kislev. Why is that a big deal? Not a big deal. Let that be fine. But what do you call it? To suggest that I just want to say that making chassan and coming to Amud Yomi is mamish unbelievable. I cannot ignore that. That's unbelievable. Wow. Kodesh Baruch Hu should see mamish Mesiras Nefesh. To get up in the morning is one thing. To get up in the morning when you're up all night before, it's something else. Yeah. Wow. Okay. We should all take a lesson, be inspired. Fine. Dr. Gemara. So Ameimar is telling us, yeah, he's telling us that Rav Chizda said in a specific lashon. I don't think that's coming to negate what we just said before, that the halacha is like Rabbi Yossi. I think that's one thing that Rav Chizda said. Now we have another lashon from Rav Chizda about rains, and Ameimar had it a bit different. Not that it's contradicting it. He has a different lashon, and that is Rav Chizda said that the halacha is like Rav Gamliel. That when do you start saying the same Talmud of Racha? On the seventh day of Cheshvan. Fine. Okay, now it says the Gemara. So Kiman Oz Lahad Tanya B'Shimon Gamliel. Who's it going like this Bryce that we have from Rav Shimon Gamliel? Aimer Geshamim Sheyardu Shiva Yomim Ze Achar Ze Atamayna Behen Revia Rishona Ushnia Ushlishas. Now we have to explain what this means. So the Gemara is asking, who is this Bryce that Rav Shimon Gamliel says that when you have rains that come down 7 days straight, if you have rains that come down 7 days straight, you're going to count that as the first of these three rains. In other words, we're saying where we have this Yaira rains, these initial rains, and if you have rains that fall 7 days straight, that you will count in these rains the first, the second, and the third. How's this going to happen? So the Gemara says, "Kiman Rabbi Yossi." This is going to go only according to Rabbi Yossi. Rav Chizda halacha Rabbi Yossi. So now we have another halacha from Rav Chizda that he says that the halacha is like Rabbi Yossi. This is a third one that we've said now about the rain, and this is the second one about Rabbi Yossi, but it's a different case. So what is this price as follows? So Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says that you have rain that falls 7 days straight, you're able to count within it the Revia Rishona, Shnia, Ushlishas. What does that mean? Says Rashi, let's look at Rashi. Zayin Yamim Bazeh Acharzeh. When we're saying 7 days of straight rain, Sheyerdu Gesham Achshav, so we mean to say is that the rain fell now, Upasku Ad Yom Shvi, right, and then it stops. The yard design yom zachar zeh. Ata meina behen rishona ushnia ushlishas. If you have rain that falls in a 7-day period, you're able to count this rishona ushnia ushlishas. And what we mean is that we're going to count the revi rishona and shnia, and the revi shnia ushlishas. Right, as Rashi says, Rabbi Yossi. This only works out according to Rabbi Yossi. How? Da liba Rabbi Yossi hache habe. Because according to the way Rabbi Yossi learns, we're able to see such a possibility. Being Revir Rishayna Ushnia, Ushnia Ushlishis. We're only able to see this possibility of 7 days of rain encountering the first and the second and the third. We're only able to see that in the position of Rabbi Yossi. Think about it. Of course, we had a few positions in the Gemara. Right, we had the position of the Gemara, if you remember. We had the position of Rabbi Meir. What did Rabbi Meir say? The first rain comes in the third of Cheshvan, the second comes in the seventh. That's only 4 days apart. Right? For 4 days apart, if you have rain that comes for 7 days, you can't count the first and the second rain. right? And then the difference between the second and the third rain was what? The second was on the 7th, and the last of the third of these Yair rains was when? On the 17th. That's more than 10. That's 10 days. So in other words, according to the way Rabbi Meir learns, if you have rain that fell 7 days, can you count the first and the second, or the second and the third? You cannot, because the first and the second is going to be only a few days, only 4 days, right, between the third and the seventh. And the second and the third is the difference between the 7th and the 17th. So you have 10 days. It doesn't work according to that. You're not going to find within the period of 7 days straight the first and the second rain. You can't see it. Yeah? Then we go to the position of Rabbi Yehuda. What's the position of Rabbi Yehuda? Rabbi Yehuda says no. Rabbi Yehuda says you start on the 7th, the second is on the 17th, and the third is on the 23rd. So according to the Rabbi Yehuda learns between the 7th and the 17th, that's 10 days. So within a 7 day period, you can't count the first and the second. And from the 17th to the 23rd, while that is true that you do have the 7th, you do have 7 days, essentially, if you count the day that it rains, you're not going to end up having enough to do the first and the second. So therefore, it doesn't work according to Rabbi Yehuda either. Good. Then we have the position of Rabbi Yossi. What did Rabbi Yossi say? Rabbi Yossi says the first rain happens on the 17th. The second is on the 23rd, and the third is on Rosh Chodesh. So now let's count. If you start from the 17th to the 23rd, and the first rain is included in the day, so you count 17. So say 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. I do use fingers just to make sure. 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23. Yes? That's 7, last I checked. Yes? That works. Now, let's do the 23 to the 30th, to Rosh Chodesh. We're not going to count now the last as the part of it. We'll say 23rd, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, right? So you're not going to count the 30th day. So it's odd, not, and don't tell me, but you did count the 23rd last time. You did count the 23rd and the 17th. I understand. Rashi is aware of it, but it's pretty close, right? It's pretty close, and therefore, says Rashi, it works. That's how you're able to, according to the sheet of Rabbi Yossi, get to say on a 7 day period of rain that falls bezeh or zeh, you're able to count Revia, the Rishona Ushnia and the Shnia Ushlishas. Because both of them have a 7 day period in between them with this little fancy accounting math. Good? That's Rashi. It's very interesting, as I pointed out, of how many times Taisus in Taanit says the same things as Rashi. So Taisus here is talking about the same exact point as Rashi, and he asks that as a question, he's bothered. How do you calculate this? So he quotes the Anshe Narbonne, right? Who are the Anshe Narbonne? Right, the men of Narbonne. Where's Narbonne? South of France. Right, the south of France, the former kingdom of Avignon, the separate kingdom that the area where the Jews lived and lived very successfully. Right, the Meiri, the Ravids, right, the Baal Amor, right, the south of France. They're the Anshe Narbonne. Who from the Anshe Narbonne? I don't know, but from that period, from that time, they had a bit of a different gear to try to answer it up. And essentially what they end up saying is maybe it's me'es la'es. Me'es la'es, the rain, right? So if it goes me'es la'es, then you don't count the 23 as a day, you count it from the time, right, that it happened. So if the rain happened on the 23, so imagine it happened sort of, in the middle of the day, then if you count out the days, then you can hit into the full day, into the 30th, and that's how you get your 7. Okay, either way. I think if you go with Maze Lays, then you have to say that the first rains happened really early on the 17th, but we'll put that on the side. But for our purposes now, what have we been searching for? We've been searching for if it rains for 7 days straight, which position would that be able to go like where you would be able to count the first rain of the year and the second rain of the year, or the second rain of the year or the third rain of the year? Where would we be able to see that? You can only really see that in Rabbi Yossi because that's the closest to getting a difference between the days of the first, second, and third rains of 7 days in each. Otherwise, you won't see it. All right, maybe Rabbi Yehuda, you have one period, but you won't have all the both periods. Okay, that's the Gemara until now. Yeah, so Dr. Gemara again. Who is it going like this? Bryce that according to Shimon Gamliel that rains that fall for 7 days straight. Ata moina behen revia rishayna ushnia that you count in it the first rain and the second, and really the best way to read it is ushnia ushlishis, and the second and third. That you're going to be able to count all those three different types of Yera rains. You're going to be able to count them all as being part of this succession of 7-day rain. So Kemak Rabbi Yossi, Rav Chisda halacha Rabbi Yossi. So now again another version of Rav Chisda saying that the halacha is like Rabbi Yossi, and for our practical intents and purposes, we are sort of done with saying Rav Chisda saying over the name that the halacha is like Rabbi Yossi, and now we're going to move on to understanding what is this point of talking about the first rain, the second rain, the third rain. I understand. Whenever it rains in Cheshvan, it's a good thing. We want it to rain as often, as much as possible. People have plowed the fields. I get it. Like, why do I have to have technical terms? Why am I discussing, the first rain is on this day or that day? Like, for what purpose? What's an afkamina? Says the Gemara, I have a few nafkaminas for you. Says the Gemara, Bishlam Rishayna. I understand why you want to talk about what's called the first rain, right? Of these initial rains, that you have to have a day that you call the first rain. Why? Lisha, because you have to know when you're supposed to start saying the same Talmud Levracha, right? It's important to know when you call the first rain being the coming, because that's when you're going to start saying. Because what did we say already before? We said in the Mishnah in the beginning of Taanit, we said, "Ein shoyel nesakishamim el samach l'gishamim." You're not supposed to start saying the same time except when the first rains, except when the rains are supposed to be there. When the rain's supposed to be there, then it's important to know because then you'll start saying the same time on that day. So it has halachic ramifications, right? It has halachic ramifications. So shlishes, why is it important to know when the third rain from this set of the first rains is supposed to happen? Why is it so important to know that? Because lisanais, they have to know when to fast. Because once these first period of rains go by and they haven't rained, then you're gonna have to start fasting. So it's vital to know when you expect it by, because then you know when you're supposed to start fasting by. Right? So that makes sense to the Gemara. That's not a question. But shnia lamai, what's the point of these second rains? What's the point of telling me like there's a date for the second rain? Why is that so important to know? Amar Zera, Linadarim. Rav Zera says that I'll give you an afkamina that has to relate to vows, right? To a vow that someone takes. All right, we turn the page on the bottom of base, the Tanan. As we learn, the Mishnah tells like this: Haneder hageshamim. Somebody makes a neder ad hagesham. In other words, whatever they said. So look at Rashi. Rashi says, "Kainam." Somebody says, "Im enemy davas ad hagesham." Somebody says, "I'm not going to have any anah until the rains." Whatever, some odd net that somebody wanted to take on. I'm not having any enough in this thing until it rains. Okay. So when is the lashon of anagishamim? Says the Gemara, Mishayar the Gesham Achetere Revi'ishnia. That period is from when the rain starts until it rains the second time. So it has to have two rains. And then it will be considered the time period when the nether would be has been chal. Anagisham, that you said, I'm not having enough from XYZ until Gesham. I mean, when the second rain happens, that's considered now that it's rained, and now you would be able to have anah from whatever that thing was that you were kind of from it. So Rashi gives us two reasons why. Let's look at Rashi. It says Rashi Acheter V'Yishniya. Right? When it comes to Nadarim, you go after the vernacular, what people say. You don't call it the rainy season until you have like a couple of rains. At that point, right, that's when the roads have gotten muddy because of the rains. Or Lashnacha, another version of Rashi has that can explain it is Ad Hagesham and Mashma Trey. It's a plural. It's a plural lashon, right? It's Mashma two. The Hainu Revishnia. It's Mashma second rain. So in other words, according to the way Rashi is learning, either one of these two approaches would be the vernacular when people are saying, someone says, Kainam, I'm not having enough from steak. I'm not having any steak until by the guy, by Lent. They're not having a certain thing, a certain time period, they're not going to have meat, whatever they take on for Lent. So somebody says, Kainam, by Lahavdil, he's saying, I'm not having any meat until the Geshamim. When is that time period? We have an nafkamina now, practical nafkamina, the second rain. You have to have two rains. Once you have the second, then you've filled your nether and you're able to have the meat again. So Rav Zvid gives it another nafkamina. Rav Zvid Omer l'zeisim. Rav Zvid says that this nafkamina is as it relates to olives. Now, anybody who has a son who's learning El Messias at some point, you know this Gemara, right? So the Gemara says what? Ditchanan, right? What does it say there? Me Masai call Adam mutar and belekav shekopeo. When is anybody, right, allowed to have lekach shekopeo? In other words, right, lekach shekopeo for the poor, right? And we're going to have now shulas rus, right? The alakatah bashibalim, right? I'm going to go and glean the gleanings, right? When the workers are working, so things fall. That depending on how much fell, you have to leave it for the poor, right? The side of the field, you have to leave it for the poor. Stuff that you forgot, right? These are things that are entitled. The poor are entitled. It's theirs. The Torah says it's theirs. You cannot go to Balabas and go cut off the corner of your field. You can't. It's not yours. Now, there is a point in the season when it's no longer a question for that's for the poor. The season's over. The poor have already come and collect whatever they wanted to collect. And now, in theory, if you were walking by somebody's field, you could go there and take from the corner of the field. You could if there was something there, you found the fruit, you could take it yourself. So me'emes I call adam mutar melekav shekopeh. It's not that we're saying that a person is mutar to go have lekach pay. No, I mean, when is it over in the season that all the poor have taken whatever they wanted to take, and now it's available for anybody. Now it's free to anybody can take. Call adam, anybody can come and take it. And as Rashi points out, I feel ashirim, even a wealthy person. When is that? What is that stage? It's mutar melekav shekopeh in mishayach on the mushais. When the Nemushas have already gone through. Who are the Nemushas? So it's interesting. Rashi here is a little bit different than Rashi Bamitzia. Again, I'm not saying it's a right to Marzchias. It's not saying, and I don't have like a strong one, the same way, like I said, but when Shmuel called Rav Abba, or Mamish, Rashi here is a different fundamental reason than Rashi in Brachas. Rashi in Brachas was because of the covet, and Rashi here was because it's Mechava. Yeah. Here I don't have such a strong one, but it's a different pasuk. In Bamitzia, right, what is the mushais? Over here, Rashi tells us that it's a lashon of mimashesh, right? What's mimashesh? Anybody remember where that's from? It's in Devar and Kisavai by the Tefecha. Mimashesh b'tzarayim, right? Like the blind person going by Fela, like he's mashesh. He's like touching. He's trying to feel. He has no idea where he's going, but it's broad daylight. He's like has no clue. Right? It's a curse because a person's going to be going Mashesh B'Tzarayim as though it was dark because he has absolutely no idea where we're going. That's how bad the situation is. But Rashi in Bava Metzia tells us a different pasuk. Right? Rashi in Bava Metzia tells us that the pasuk was that Lo Yamushu, right? Lo Yamushu from the Machane, Hakadosh Baruch Hu Lo Yomish. Right, that's a different lashon. That's not from Tercha. That's a lashon from Parashas B'Shalach. All right, so different, a bit of a different idea. But fundamentally, if the nemushas come through, then everyone else is in the siyayish because the nemushas go very slowly and they're very thorough. And when they're done, there's nothing left. And that's why it's open to anybody now to come along and eat. Says Rashi, Mishiach nemushas b'sadeh. The mikan ve'elch nesiyais yisharanim. Once the nemushas come through, all the other aniyim, they give up. They're not coming back. Levisha yaydin. Everyone knows. And nishar lekesh shekopeh nemushas nitlom. If there was something left from lekesh shekopeh, those nemushas they didn't miss it. They go very slowly, methodically, and thoroughly. Yeah. So Zad the Gemara, that will be the nafkamina. Maybe I call it mutar meleka b'shekol peh b'shekol nemushes. That's when it comes to leka shekol peh. The parrot of oilus. These are the different things that go to the aniyim as it relates to the vineyards, right? So when is that available for public consumption? So that's mishayach aniyim mikarem v'yavoy. That's when the aniyim have gone through the vineyard once, and then they came back and they went through it a second time. So once they've gone through it twice, you can imagine that they've taken whatever they want, and now it's open to public consumption. The zaysim, when is it that zaysim are becoming available for public consumption? What is their time period? is Mishaterid Revia Shnia, and when the second rain comes about, right? So now we have a practical nafkamina that we just found. It took us a bit of learning about the different matnas aniyim, but fundamentally, you see it has a halachic import. Revia Shnia is very important because now you know when you're able to go collect by the olive trees. Anyone's able to go collect by the olive trees, even if they're an ashir, they can go and have an olive without worrying about it once once the second rain has happened. The Gemara wants to know now, just linguistically, my nemushas. What are nemushas? What is this language of saying these kinds of poor people that are coming through? Rabbi Yochanan Sabe da Azli Tigra. Right, the old people that they're going with the walking stick. They're going with the walking stick. That's what Taisa says. Pirish. Remember the Taisa when he says Pirish. Look at these Taisa. First Taisa is Pirish. Second Taisa is just Pirish. Third Taisa is Pirish. Right. So again, as I pointed out, this is something that is a phenomenon to Masechus Taanit. Yeah. So Rashi also explains what it means. Sabida Azli Atigra. Right. Rashi tells us Heichel Menachas Ein Itzvei. Right. They're going with Menachas. Slowly. They're looking carefully. Or second part of Rashi is Maksik Beplach, right? They're holding onto the stick. As the Torah says, Pirsha Halachim and Maklis. They're going with the stick, Vinish Animal, and they're resting on it. So mamish the same thing, yeah? Reish Lakish Amar Likute Basa Likute, right? It's those that are coming in after those that have come in. So right, what does it mean? Explains Rashi. Ani Melech B'nai Acharav. And Ani is taking a son that comes after him. Once the Ani comes in and the son comes in, like everyone else gives up hope. There's not going to be anything left. All right. So now we have had a couple of nafkaminas. We had Nadarim and we have Matnas Aniyim. So for two nafkaminas. Now we have another nafkamina. Papa says, Kedei lahach b'shvila rishus. Third nafkamina is in order to be able to go along b'shvila rishus. So what is b'shvila rishus? It's just important to just mention that the Gemara Bava Kama, Hey Aleph, the Gemara tells us there about the 10 different ikonis that Yeshua made when they come into Eretz Yisrael. Among those takanas are we're able to go to the bathroom, right? A mace is kind of a mace mitzvah, right? Somebody died. He died in somebody's private house. What? The mace mitzvah, no one's there to bury him. He gets buried over there. Yeah. So among these 10 takanas, one was what we call an easement, I think, or a right of way, like in zoning terminology, basically, right? Sometimes there's an easement or a right of way on somebody's land. Right? You're not allowed to veer off, but you're allowed to take that route. You don't have to go all the way around in order to be able to get from point A to point B. You're allowed to go through. Again, if that was done illegally, then you're not allowed to do it. But one of the conditions that Yeshua had for settlement of the Jewish people in Eretz Yisrael was this ability to go through to have an easement. But the easement we're talking about is not a permanent easement; it's an impermanent easement. It only exists during the summer, during like the dry season. Why? Because once it's the rainy season and now the fields are plowed, so if you're going to take the easement, you're going to ruin whatever the plantings are. So you're not allowed to go through it then. You're only allowed to go through it in the dry season when it's not going to have any impact on the field. So Rav Papa says, here's another nafkamina. It's able to when you're able to use these easements, the Amar Mar, you're allowed to go on these specific easements, on these right of ways, when and this is literally there in the Gemara of Akam, you'll see, until the second rain. Why? Because by the time the second rain comes in, as Rashi explains, is that when the second rain happens, Rashi says, already there's enough tzvua that's growing the kosher l'dis regal. And when you're going to walk on it with your feet, you're going to be breaking it down. And so you're going to be ruining the guy's field. So obviously, once the second rain happens, no more going in no more using the easement, only for the dry season. Yeah, so now we have a whole bunch of nafkaminas, and now we have one final nafkamina. That's Rav Nachman Yitzchak Malavar Perish Shvius. They get rid of the Perish Shvius. What do you mean Perish Shvius? It's an there are certain things that even though it's Shvius, you're allowed to nevertheless take for yourself. The Tanan, learn the Mishnah, and Moshe Nan B'Sarfim B'Tevin V'Kash Shel Shvius. When you were allowed to take the Tevin and the Kash of Shvius, right, the straw, the hay of Shvius, and have it, for your animals, for your sheep, for your goats, for your horses. When are you allowed to use it? Until the second rain happens. What do you mean? My time, what's the reason for this? Right? The thing could be the straw and the hay could be for your behemoths and the chayas in your land. But we now explain what do you mean v'hemtecha v'lachaya asher b'artzecha tiya kol tevuas halecha. What do we mean? We mean like this: kol zman shechaya chelas b'soda. So long as there is enough for the undomesticated animals that you don't have in your barn to be able to find the straw and the hay in your field and to be able to enjoy it accordingly. So then ha'achal of hemta babayis. Then you're able to feed it for your animals in your home. But kalei l'chaim and asada. But once it's over for the chaya in the fields, once they're not going to be able to find it, kalei l'chaim t'cham and abayis. Then you have to get rid of it from your house. You have to bring it back out. You can no longer hold it because now there's not enough. There's not enough for the animals outside, so you have to bring it. What you have inside, you have to bring it outside now. Fine. So we have now another nafkamina as it relates to shvius for when do you have a situation where the Revia Shnia is important. And as we see, Revia Rishon is important for the same time. Revia Shnia is important for either one of these Nadarim or the situation of Matnas Aniyim, or it's important in relation to B'Shvila Rishus in terms of zoning laws, or it's important in terms of Shvius. All of these potential nafkaminas for Revia Shnia. And then Revia Shlish is right, for the Yaira is important. Why? In order to know when the Yechidin have to start fasting if there wasn't rain by the Revia Shlishis. Fine. So now we go to a bit of a new Gemara. Amar Ravo. My Lashon Revia. What does it mean, Lashon of Revia? The Dover Revia is a karka. It's a matter that will penetrate right the karka. Right. It's sort of like the bilus. It's like the bow of the earth. Rav Yehuda mitra bow of the ara. Rav Yehuda said that the rain is like the husband of the earth. Right, the pasuk tells us Bilam made fun of the Jewish, made fun of the Rebbeinu Shalom. Right, he said, "Umispar es roiva Yisrael." Right, you remember the pasuk in Parashat Balak. So over there, you look in Chazal, look at the Gemara there that Bilam was making fun. This is what the Rebbeinu Shalom is spending his time. Yeah, spending his time. There's more to say on it, but we don't have the time right now. Right. So what do we have a pasuk? We say it over every fast about Haftarah. When the rain, the snow falls from the heavens, it doesn't return back to the heavens. Right? It's going to go and make the ground wet, and from there it's going to be growing all the seeds and sprouts, etc. So that's what we have a lashon, and we call the rain revia. It's the same lashon as people use in relation to intimate language because it's doing effectively the same thing to the ground. The first rain is to be able to get into the karka, one tafach. Shnia, the second rain is in order to be able to become muddy enough that you could actually scoop up some of the mud and now use it to stop up a bottle. So Amar Rav Chizda, yes, Amar Rav Chizda, Yishamim sheyardu kidei lagav ben pichaves ein b'hem mishum v'atzar. Right, the rain that comes down sufficiently in order to be able to close off the mouth of a chavis, that doesn't have v'atzar. In other words, you stay v'atzar hashemayim, you're not going to have any atziros. You're not going to have any atziros. You're not going to have any. Tell the guy come in. There's not going to be a situation of atzar hashemayim. The pasuk in Vayim Shemaya is not going to be a problem, right? When you say if somebody's not behaving, right? So Hakadosh Baruch is going to stop the rains. V'atzar hashemayim, there's no problem with atzar hashemayim in relation to the rain. When is it rain coming down enough and that the ground is muddy, then you certainly don't have a situation of a curse. You don't have a situation of I'll have to stop over here. Fine.